folks. Just giving everybody a minute together. We'll start soon. Welcome, everybody. We will start in a few seconds. All right. The number of participants has stopped going up, so I think it's time to start. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to today's BDC Presents. I have been really looking forward to this event. We have a great webinar and a conversation with a very talented panel from some amazing organizations who are taking the initiative to try and overcome a very specific but important challenge for our sector, that of incentive data. My name is Andre Murer. I am Director of Digital Product with the BDC, and I'll be a host for today. I am very excited to bring you this webinar about the Node Collective. And with that, we'll get started. So first, a little bit about the BDC. So the Building Decarbonization Coalition is on a mission to eliminate pollution from buildings. That's why we come to work every day. We are a coalition aligning consumers, policymakers, workers, market actors, environmental groups, the building industry stakeholders at all levels on a path to transform the nation's buildings through clean energy using policy, research, market development, and public engagement. Membership with the BDC is free. Did you know? Well, now you do. So if you're not yet a member, then you can go to buildingdecarb.org and click join the coalition. Or at the very least, you can subscribe to our newsletter. We are very grateful to our Trailblazer members who make annual donations to support BDC's membership program. The financial support from our Trailblazer members allows the BDC to keep all of our webinars, including this one, and reports and other resources free and available to anyone who wants them. Now for some housekeeping. Everybody, please take 2 seconds right now to double check that you're muted. This webinar is being recorded. It'll be placed on our website's resource library, at which point you'll be able to share the recording with all your loved ones. Please use the chat. We do like to see lots of activity there. It makes for a lively conversation. You can put questions for our panelists and comments for the entire group on the chat. We will keep track of all the questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the Q&A. And then answers to all questions, including those that we cannot get to today, as well as additional resources, will be emailed to everyone next week. Now for today's hosts. Andre Murer, yours truly. Excuse me. I am Director of Digital Products with the BDC, where I lead the development of tools such as the Incentive Finder and the Contractor Finder, which are core to the Switches On campaign to educate and support consumers as they make the switch to a decarbonized home. Autumn Proudlove is Managing Director of Policy and Markets at the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center. Autumn leads the center's policy program, which includes the nationally recognized database of state incentives for renewable and efficiency, which you all might know as DESIRE. Deandria Salvador leads partnership initiatives at Eli Technologies, which streamlines access to rebates, tax credits, and financing for clean energy and electrification upgrades. Deandria also serves on the executive committee of the National Council of Electricity Policy. Excuse me. Also with Eli, Federico Andrade is a product manager working on their digital platform. Freddie specializes on the incentive data ecosystem, including ingestion and maintenance of incentive data. Lacey Tan of RMI is a manage in their carbon-free buildings program. where she is responsible for cross-cutting analytics and policy research in support of eliminating fossil fuel use in buildings. She brings to RMI over a decade of experience in advancing clean energy and climate policy. And last, but definitely not least, Tom Cotton is VP of Engineering at Rewiring America. Tom leads the in-house development of software tools, including Rewiring America's Incentive Calculator, API, and Personal Electrification Planner. Incidentally, Tom has the most charming accent of anyone on this panel, so you are in for a treat, folks. All right, let's talk about how we can power electrification through open data. So the Node Collective was launched a couple of months ago by the organizations hosting today's webinar. It is an initiative with the ambition to create the most comprehensive database of incentives in the US and make it available to everyone. I'll start by giving everybody some context on what the Node Collective is and why we believe this initiative is needed right now. A very, very short origin story is that a bunch of organizations that were attempting to create their own database of electrification incentives for the purposes of supporting their own research in their own tools realized that doing a comprehensive job was an incredibly challenging problem. And that's because the data is by its nature fragmented across many, many different sources. So accurate and up-to-date data is sometimes difficult to find, and it's certainly difficult to keep up to date. Incentive program data lives on multiple websites, in databases, in PDF files, in program handbooks, and other sources. It was also clear that many other orgs, from retailers, manufacturers, municipalities, community-based organizations, tech startups, everybody in the space really sees this as a barrier to creating tools and resources that can make electrification incentives easier to understand and more accessible for consumers and contractors. And we believe that solving this problem for the entire industry is really too big a task for any one organization to do it alone. So what was needed was for us all to join forces and as an entity that is more than the sum of its parts. So we all came together around a collective effort. The National Open Data for Electrification Node Collective is a nonprofit alliance dedicated to sourcing, structuring, and maintaining comprehensive data on every residential electrification incentive program in the US. That is a mouthful, but when we talk about incentives and about how fragmented and inconsistent and unstructured this data is, what are we really talking about? All right, so surely the number of incentives that help people save money when installing a heat pump or buying an induction stove or a home battery storage, surely there aren't that many, right? So let's walk through it real quick. So the upcoming rebates from the Inflation Reduction Act are soon coming to states. So let's call that 50 different incentives or so, or at least, right, since there are different types of equipment, they're going to be covered. Then soon after that, we'll have the IRA Homes program. And let's not forget the several federal tax credits. So now we're up to 100, maybe 200 incentives nationally, just within the scope of the IRA. Then we bring on multiple wide programs like Tech Clean California or Mass Save in Massachusetts, just two examples. And then we have many hundreds of incentives, maybe more, provided by utilities and CCAs across the country. And that's all before you start layering rebates at the municipality level. So overall, we estimate that there are more than 5,000 electrification and energy efficiency incentives in the United States. Each of those incentives is managed by a different organization. These programs are constantly in flux. So these incentives are created, they're modified, they're retired, then they're brought back. Funding levels for these programs are always evolving. The eligibility requirements can be different for each program across geographic coverage, technology specs, different income qualification requirements. So really creating a unified database brings three main challenges. The first one is sourcing i.e. sort of just finding and getting a hold of all this data. The second one is putting all of that into a single structure that we can all agree on and that can support many different applications, from things like policy, research, e-commerce, consumer tools, tools that streamline the application process for contractors, probably other things. And then the third challenge, which is really maintaining it, keeping it up to date and relevant as these programs evolve and change. And since many organizations are independently creating spreadsheets of research to wrestle with incentives in their own unique way, the members of Node were of the view that the first challenge to tackle was to agree on a common structure, right? So a standard open data format will provide a common language to simplify the other two challenges of sourcing and maintaining the data. This data format, also called a schema, has been the main focus of all of us in the Node Collective over the past few months. We have formed an initial opinion about this data structure. This was based on the independent work that each of the 5 orgs has done to date. And despite not having full coverage, between us, we manage around 2,000 of those data points, which is a very sizable data set. So clearly, it is not a complete picture, and we're hoping that others here will be able to join us in the effort to help us get there. But we feel very confident that what we've come up with is a great starting point that can evolve as this makes more contact with real-world use cases. So now we're going to take a few minutes to geek out on some data design. The format and coverage of this data are probably the 2 most common questions that we get about Node. So it's worth doing a little bit of a deep dive on the work that we've done to date. For those of you who are not technical, don't worry, we're not going to get too in the weeds. But I'll hand over to Freddie, who's been leading some truly stellar cross-organization efforts to coordinate the data workstream for Node. And then after this deep dive, we'll come back to the panel for a conversation and then a Q&A. So Freddie, take it away.
Thank you, Andre. So yeah, as Andre mentioned, this is a really fractured space. And so figuring out what is common among the different use cases that the 5 founding members of the collective have, and how can we ultimately put together a shape that can meet all of our needs and also the needs beyond. That was our objective, at least for this first period. And so what that looked like in practice was we effectively hosted workshops for a couple of months straight, in which each organization would show their structure, their concepts, the terms they use to represent this information. Those terms that were common, we separated, and those that were not common, those that were unique to a certain organization's way of seeing or interpreting the data underneath, we then had really substantive conversations around what do we do with that? How do we integrate it? Is it necessary? Is it a way of maybe reimagining and looking at the data in a new way? And so through this exercise, we were able to come out with, I think, a really detailed description, which we're going to take a look at in just a moment. But before we do, a tangible example of that, which I think we can look at as we go forward, is what one organization might call an incentive. Another organization might distinguish into 3 or 4 based on their underlying characteristics. And so going through this effective horse trading exercise and figuring out what is common and how do we get there allowed us to ultimately put together what we're going to show you guys today. So structurally speaking, what does that mean? It means we have, at present, 5 different tables of information that we're going to be structuring. The core one, naturally, is the incentive. But there are other important pieces of information here. The incentive belongs to a program, and that program, in turn, to an authority. Now, an authority can have multiple programs, and a program can have multiple incentives. We're going to take a look specifically at the incentives in just a moment, but from the top, an incentive has 1 or more areas that describe the geographic characteristics of that incentive. There's a lot of complexity to handle there, and I think we have a really flexible and simple way to do that. And similarly, an incentive has amount configurations. And so whether an incentive will have a flat rate of $1,000 for a given technology, or if it has some form of percentage-based or even relative amount of money based on some underlying underpinning characteristic, all of that is able to get documented in the structure that we're putting together. Now, to take a closer look at the incentive record, we have, and this is just a visual aid, but 2 or 3 things to drill in over here. The incentive will have a source URL. Effectively, we're concerned with traceability of information. We want to be able, in the node representation, to understand where is this information coming from for a given incentive. Is it perhaps the program website? Maybe there's a PDF hosted somewhere. We want to ensure the ability to trace that all the way back. Similarly, I'm particularly interested in how incentives interact with one another. Is there an exclusion described? Is there a prerequisite where you can only access this incentive with or after a second? All of that information, again, gets coordinated in here, but perhaps a really interesting way of looking at some of the challenges that this arises comes through talking about technology. We have a few different fields in here which come with a large amount of potential options of values. And each organization certainly brought our own unique list of eligible or valid options associated with that. And we'll take a look at that, how we handled that, or how we're in the process of addressing that over in the next slide. But thinking about how Eli Technologies, for instance, represents the different kinds of upgrade measures that are available, we handle 278 different types of upgrade measures. Other organizations showed up with perhaps 30 or 50, or certainly nowhere near as many. And so coming together and having a conversation about, should we be grouping things down? Should we be reinterpreting or coming up with a more effective way of describing what these incentives ultimately correspond to, is an exercise that we have gone through across many of the different fields, not only the technology one. This is a good example of that. If you look at authority level, the different organizations that showed up all represented the state of authority completely differently, or with a little bit of overlap in some cases. Technology, as I mentioned before, we'll have an example of heat pumps, where we have, again, at Eli, something like 25 different heat pump types that we can acknowledge. That certainly is very granular and perhaps not a general purpose use. So finding that generic interpretation has been our objective, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that so far. Now, certainly this is a complexity, and it's not the only one. There are many other challenges that we have faced, we're in the process of facing, and that we certainly will be facing moving forward. Not least of those challenges is the fact that we, by definition, started out with only 5 organizations and 5 use cases. We are not able to address many of these challenges without additional support and the voices of the organizations in this room, and certainly beyond. Representing various use cases is the only way that we can ensure that this incentive structure, the schema, and ultimately the organization is able to fulfill its mission. Other specific challenges that I can touch on worth discussing. One of them is the fact of inconsistent representations of the data. Just looking at these 5 organizations and how we've done that representation, already we've seen there's a lot of challenges there. But if we look at the fact that there are 5,000 or so incentives out in the world, all represented effectively in the way that the organizations are representing them, there's very little overlap necessarily. And so how can we go about managing that complexity? That's certainly a challenge that is underway for us. And to touch on something Andre started with, another core concern for us is this aspect of maintenance. Once we've ingested a certain program, a certain incentive, that information is effectively static. The minute the program goes and changes an amount or an eligibility criteria or something like that, we have to do something about that, right? And so what are the processes for improving maintenance? That's certainly something that we're going to be building moving forward. And I think to really just bring this to its conclusion, all of this we're very excited to bring to you, to show you the data, to show you the structure, and also to receive input, hear your voices, your comments, your thoughts. The schema is going to be available on our website, on the Node Collective website, along with a contact form, at least to start. And that way, hopefully, we can get the ball moving. Thank you very much, Andre. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And I pass it back to you for a panel.
Thanks, Freddie. Okay. So now we're going to take a bit of a step back and have a conversation with our panelists. I am going to stop sharing my screen so you can all see their beautiful faces. And then we shall start. Okay. Okay. Jumping straight into it. I'm going to start with Lacey. So Lacey, what do you see as the market opportunity for rebates, incentives, and tax credits over the coming years?
Great. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Well, we see the market opportunity as enormous over the next decade, right? I mean, we've estimated that there could roughly be about 100 billion in incentives that roll out over the next 5 years for energy efficiency and building decarbonization. And this includes stuff like the IRA incentives, like the home energy rebates, the home electrification appliance rebates, 25C tax credit. And then if you add on the existing longstanding programs like the Weatherization Assistance Program and then the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, and all of that with the utility-based programs, state-funded program, and then local programs. So that's a huge market of incentives. And, as we've talked about on this webinar, the current system is not working. And so as we have a new influx over these next few years of lots of incentives, this is a really great time to start building this data set and this open data source for everyone. Thanks.
All right, Tom, here's one for you. We get a lot of questions about the kinds of incentives that will be available through Node. What's the coverage of the data currently? And this is really the top question that I get is where can people get it?
Yeah, I'm just reviewing my notes here. I'm going to take the second part first, actually. I think it is a very natural question here. Where can we get it? I think as Andre and Freddie outlined, we've been working together to standardize on that schema and description as a sort of prerequisite to merging that data set and then distributing that data set. And we have the challenge of we don't want to do that in isolation or in secret. We want to start to take on input, but we also recognize the frustration in announcing an organization that doesn't have anything to give you yet. So thank you all for your patience and interest. And I'm also fascinated by all the questions that are coming in and keen to get to those. So where can we get it? It will definitely be available in the open on the Node Collective website and through other channels that we can find where people may go looking for this data. We'll work to get that information out there, but we acknowledge it's not here yet. On the coverage question, it's easier to answer that question as the five founding members than to answer that question as Node, because as of yet we don't have a single unified data set. But the data set we're working together to produce, we estimate will be over 5,000 incentives across the federal level, state level, utility level, and local level. And it will cover, we're predominantly focused as members on residential and single family, though some of us have multifamily and commercial incentives to bring to the table as well, and we'll get to that in time. And it will cover a broad range of electric appliances and electric enabling technologies and decarbonization enabling technologies. So we do get to things like, everybody loves the e-bikes, and we do get to things like smart thermostats and other stuff. And we may not get to the sort of long tail of energy efficiency incentives. That's still an open question for the group. But if you get into things like, Energy Star approved fridges and things like that. Energy Star themselves are a great source of information for those kinds of details. So we as a collective will focus on those decarbonization and electrification incentives first. I think, oh yeah, one more note on coverage. What we have not got to in any depth yet is supporting information about particular incentives, and that would include the deeper appliance standards, participating contractor networks, and stuff like that. And again, it's hard to speak for the collective at this stage, but I think that reflects where we're at today.
Okay.
I'll pass it back
Thank
to you,
you.
Andre.
Right. Now one for Autumn. So Autumn, one of the main challenges we've identified is just getting a hold of all this data from different sources. Can you talk a bit about how the Node Collective will source this data? In other words, like where is the data coming from and how we will keep it up to date?
Yeah. So currently the founding members of Node, we rely on a mixture of manual research, some automated monitoring, some groups use some AI-assisted workflows, as well as direct contributions from incentive program administrators and from the general public. And from Desire's perspective, a lot of this research really is manual research for the time. Over time, as Node gets funding available, we hope that data maintenance responsibilities will hopefully, transition to the collective, with members using this shared foundational data in their different tools and websites. So we're discussing the right ways for our members to play to their existing strengths right now. For example, with Desire, we have staff that has incentive expertise that are doing this research and updating, and then a number of Node members also have working relationships with the program administrators themselves. So we want to leverage these existing strengths and assets that we can all bring to the table. And then in the long term, the goal is to work with programs to directly publish information about their incentives in a standardized format. This is obviously easier said than done, but even if we get 20, 30, 50% of programs using some sort of a standard format and making direct contributions, then it cuts down tremendously on the amount of manual research that will be required.
Thank you, Autumn. Okay. A quick one back to Freddie. Can you share more about the Node Collective current roadmap and some upcoming milestones?
Absolutely. As Tom mentioned already, the first thing we have to finish on this roadmap is getting that final alignment on the final details of this schema document. Once that's done, we all have to individually, the organizations, transform our data into that shape. Once that's accomplished, merging all that data, handling any collisions, deduplicating all of that, that'll allow us to say we now have a node data set. Once we have the node data set, we can start worrying about this maintenance concern, as Autumn mentioned, in a little bit more detail. Are there efficiencies we can achieve through some other new technologies? Is there AI that we should be leveraging in a more intelligent way? We'll cross that bridge. But once we've got to that point, then we can start thinking about, okay, how do we expand the scope of the actual content itself, the data itself? Can we bring in new information sources? Can we start really drilling into, partnerships with the authors of the information? And perhaps in the future, at some point, expand the scope beyond home electrification towards commercial, maybe industrial. That's what things currently look like.
Thanks, Freddie. D'Andrea, so the Node Collective is being launched as a kind of a broad coalition of partners, right? I can say that, like, for the BDC and its own role as a coalition, we were very excited about joining Node to make incentive data a public good that is available to the entire sector. And we can see, how this repository can support the Switches On campaign to educate and assist homeowners and contractors in making more informed decisions and saving money when switching to electric. Can you talk about what inspired Eli to join Node as a company focused on providing tools for contractors? Like, how do you believe Node can benefit the entire ecosystem?
Yeah, so like you, I think really underpinning the value of this data being open, accessible, and a public good. So for us at Eli, we're looking at how to keep our contractor tools up to date. We know that that confidence is really necessary and needed to build trust between contractors and ultimately their consumers, whether that is from an educational and informed recommendation standpoint to actually delivering services and customer satisfaction. But what I'm really also inspired by this is that I believe there can be a number of additional use cases on top of what our individuals, organizations are collectively right now seeing as opportunities. I know that there is certainly a hope for this to additionally tap into policy use cases or just research and other informational use cases, such as our other organizations here. So I really believe that as this continues to grow and expand, even outside of just the context of, contractors or the direct-to-consumer tools we're seeing, I believe that we may be surprised by really where this data can take us in the, hopefully near future.
In Lacey, the same for RMI. Like, how do you envision this repository supporting the work that RMI does in advancing market-based solutions, especially in the residential sector?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of opportunity to identify some of like the market trends and gaps, particularly in electrification incentives. And I think it could help to drive policy. We can do some strategic planning and development of market-based solutions that, are aimed at fostering this inclusive clean energy environment transition. I also think it could help, and there's a question earlier that it was really interesting around how are we going to layer all these? How are we going to understand the gaps in push policy? And I think that there's a great opportunity here for us to see. I mean, it's 2024 and we live in a very advanced technological age. And the fact that there's not an API available for all of this information, and there's not somebody helping to do this. So I really think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to see, like, where is it a gap and to advance some legislation or opportunities, and particularly policy around those incentives, but also accessibility in the data, right? And making it easier just for everyone. So yeah, that's what I see.
Oh, so I heard API. So that's a perfect segue for Tom. So basically the same question to you, like, how do you see Node complementing Rewiring America's existing tools and resources, like the API and the calculator? I think I did see a question in a chat specifically about what the relation, how is this different from the rewiring calculator?
Yeah, I can take that. I mean, I think the setting that we talked about at the top of the call around, what we as members recognized as we're all setting out to do this individually. I can describe a little bit about what we've been doing at Rewiring over the past year or so. We started with a calculator that described the Inflation Reduction Act incentives, the forthcoming rebates and the existing tax credits. And that calculator tool, initially it just lived in browser code. We gradually moved it to be an API because we saw the value in sharing that information and sharing the calculator itself more broadly. And as we learned about what people were trying to communicate with this stuff and also the evolving landscape of incentives, we realized like a natural extension of that tool is to start to talk about other state programs and utility programs, especially because we were describing incentives that weren't available yet. And there actually is a huge landscape of stuff that you can use today. And so we spent most of last year on this effort, expanding our coverage to state and utility incentives and learning about that landscape. And all of this is feeding into the work we're doing with the collective now. And while we could see a path to maintaining that information responsibly and continuing to shore that up internally, we recognize like we're benefiting a lot from direct access to programs. We're taking calls with state energy officers and major utilities and getting them to collaborate with us on what ultimately is a big bag of spreadsheets, and seeing that other organizations were solving similar problems, but also other organizations were approaching program administrators and state energy officers and so on with very similar sets of questions. And if you can if you can dare to dream in a process like this, you're like, oh, this would be so much easier if it was centralized, or this would be so much easier if there were shared tools around it, or this would be so much easier if we were all sharing what we had learned. And that's, as we talk to other organizations, that's the genesis of the collective. So within Rewiring's tools, I mean, we've got coverage around 10 states. We have what we think is fairly thorough coverage of state utility and local incentives. And today that information is going to flow from us into the node collective processes. It's going to get merged and deduplicated into that shared schema that Freddie described. And we're going to figure out how to publish that unified data set that becomes Node's data set. So at some point, the flow of information needs to reverse from members sort of pouring data into Node Collective to Node Collective being upstream of all of us and us consuming that, and us investing that time and energy we've been putting into maintenance, into strong relationship building, and into working with program admins. We're investing that time and energy through the collective, so that we're not taxing those program admins as much. And so we have a stronger voice and a more unified voice when we go to them and say, hey, we'd really love you to publish this information on your own websites directly. So that's the kind of end game. But the messy middle is like, how and when do we reverse that flow of the direction of the flow of data from our own tools into Node to it coming the other way. And I'm going to put in a plug. We're hiring at Rewiring America for a product manager to work on this space with me and my team who think about incentive data every day. That would have an impact on our contributions to Node Collective, as well as an impact on Rewiring America's consumer-facing tools. Thanks so much. I'll pass it back to Andre.
Great to hear. Autumn, speaking about desire for a moment, I mean, you can speak with a lot of authority there. The database has been around for a long time. What sort of insights can you share on the challenges and opportunities in collecting and maintaining a database of incentives?
Sure. Yeah, Desire has been around for a long time. It was created in 1995. So we've learned a lot about collecting and maintaining comprehensive incentive data over the years. I think a lot of the challenges of collecting this data have been alluded to. You have 50 different states, you have 3,000 different utilities. Nobody likes to make their programs the same. And then even on websites, they're all presented differently. They're in different places. So it's a huge challenge just to collect this information. But then I think the even bigger challenge is in maintaining it. And that's what we found to be the case over the years. The programs are constantly changing, they're expiring, new programs are being created. So it's a lot to keep up with, and you want to make sure that you're providing consumers with accurate information. And you don't want consumers to see, one incentive amount here, one incentive amount here, different information coming from different sources, and then making bad purchasing decisions based on that. So, because of that, we found that the opportunity with Node here, because we're joining forces, we could have a better chance of finding a sustainable way to maintain this data. A lot of people like to fund new cool policy or incentive tools, but then maintaining the tools over time, it takes a lot of effort, or it takes a lot of buy-in from administrators. And so coming together and trying to solve that challenge together, I think gives us a much better chance at it.
Good stuff. Okay, so now, Deandra, I'm going to hand over to you so you can wrap up this conversation for us before we go into Q&A. We've seen a lot of excitement and interest about Node. Lots of people in organizations, big and small, have been reaching out, putting their hands up, asking how they can help. Can you share how interested parties can get involved with the Node Collective and help shape this data repository? And I do know you've got slides for this, so I'll just share again and we can get going.
Absolutely. So while the data working group is still working through a number of getting the schema online, we still have a few ways for folks to get involved. So if you go to the next slide, we see three main areas that people are kind of hand raising for the categories of how they want to contribute. So or be a part of this ecosystem. So we noticed that a lot of organizations have data themselves and want to contribute. So once the schema is available for feedback, review, to suggest potential changes, we'll very quickly also start looking at ways for organizations to contribute their data to the repository, as well as we hope that this data can be used in, as we heard, a variety of use cases, whether that is plugging into someone else's existing or newly formed tool or being utilized to help identify gaps in other helpful information. And then additionally, we will be looking for ways to help support Node financially. One really exciting development for Node is just last month, we were recently adopted as a sandbox project of the Linux Foundation, specifically LF Energy. So as soon as next week, we will be officially doing our LF Energy onboarding and developing our governance and other structure. But even before then, if you go to the next slide, there's a few ways after this webinar for folks to find out a little bit more and also get in touch. So two things I want to call out is at the very top link, which we'll also put into the chat. We're going to be essentially rolling off of the Google group and starting to utilize the LF Energy group and community forum services. So this is an open listserv and discussion. You can set your notifications however you like, such that you can ask questions, be able to reach out to all of us who are on the call today, and even share ideas as a part of the LF Energy list that will be dedicated to Node. In addition to that, we're starting to build a wiki where it will have a bit of information about frequently asked questions once the schema is available. In addition to the website, we'll be sure to have a link on the wiki to point folks to the Node main website and answer any questions about that and feedback as well. And in addition to that, if you go to the final, there are a few other ways to get involved. So we are kicking off now that we have officially started to lean into being LF Energy nonprofit project, is having open steering committee meetings. So our next meeting will be June 26th, and we have a link to that in our wiki. But additionally, if you reached out to our inbox at Node or any of those other channels, we can make sure you get a registration link too. So those are open meetings for 1 hour where you can listen to any updates that we are having about Node. You also can reach out to us if you want to be formally added to our agenda about any particular discussion items, as well as we will be having one-on-one time for individuals or organizations that want to talk with our founding organizations about maybe a really specific or unique opportunity or thing to consider. We can do that as well. I also noticed a question, and yes, the current Google group we will be rolling off of, and the LF Energy listserv will be replacing that. If you sign up for the Google group, we can send you the notification that we've been moved over, but you will have to accept it. Additionally, there is a super easy email, which is essentially the name of our listserv with a dash to subscribe that I'll drop in the chat. If you email our subscription email, then that's another simple way to get into the LF Energy Node Collective specific listserv too. And then all you have to do is reply to the confirmation email, and you don't have to go online or do any of those additional sign up steps. So I'll add that to the link as well, but we really just want to, we have some good time to dive into questions. And I think, Andre, with that, we want to first thank everybody who has spent, a lot of time over the last few months to start digging into a pretty meaty topic that also can have a lot of impact really across the US and in many different communities and use cases. And also thank everybody for joining us on the call today. I think the amount of activity that we're seeing in the chat just shows how passionate and dedicated folks here on this call are, as well as really the way that we'll be able to accelerate all of our initiative by opening this up even more and getting the feedback and participation and engagement for all of you. So thanks, Andre. I'll pass it back over to you.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, Sarpelis. Thank you, everybody who has dropped comments and questions. I think we can get to a few of them now. I'm going to ask some help of the panelists because there's like so many. We have this whole log going on of like 30 plus questions at this point. So I'm going to get some help from the panelists themselves. If there's anything in there that's interesting, feel free to jump in. I will start by answering a very quick one because I think it's an important point that maybe we didn't stress enough. So Cooper was asking whether this data will be freely accessible or whether this is a commercial offering that folks must pay to access. This data will be freely available to everybody. It is not a commercial offering. So just to make that piece clear. Anything else in here, folks, that you'd like to tackle? And by the way, any other participants who want to come off mic to ask your questions, please do so. It's fine. We want to see you.
Okay, I can add on to the freely available question. We have a similar question we've got a few times around, will Node offer its own API? The current roadmap does not include us doing that. We want to encourage each of the members and additional members and other people who just want to take the data and build their own things on top to do so. I think we have a couple of open questions around, do we require sign up to use the data so that we can keep track of who's using it and get feedback, and so that we can notify people if there were problems with the data that we've distributed. There are a few reasons why it may not be as simple as just clicking a link and downloading it from the website. There may be a step or two. We're working through that at the moment, but it absolutely won't be a paid offering. And we want to encourage people to build paid offerings on top. If you're adding value, hitting those SLAs or going through those security questionnaires that larger enterprise customers are going to require of you, things like that, that's not something that Node is going to be in a position itself to do in the short term. And so we want to encourage, an ecosystem on top of that.
There's a question about, there's at least 2 or 3 questions about who Node is intended for. Like, is it for contractors, for third-party implementers, program admins, contractors, consumers? Does anybody in the panel want to tackle that one?
Sure. Yeah. Everyone who wants to access incentives, right? I mean, anyone that's in this space and needs to utilize it, I think. And sometimes I know when we design products, you typically have a user in mind, right? But, I think it is intended for, it's taking a fragmented landscape and making it accessible. So it's data and information. And, we expect all the different end users to use it however they would normally for their business needs or market needs, right? So if you're a contractor, it might be helpful in your area to see what's available, what's been updated in that region, versus if you're working at a state energy office and you're trying to understand your incentives versus maybe a neighboring county or another state's incentives, right? And so there's a lot of opportunities to compare. And then I think also policymakers could see, where those gaps are to identify where they need to, is it aligning with our state energy goals? Are we giving too many incentives for one measure versus the other? Like, what's happening? Are these being, so it's pretty much everyone, say. That's our intention.
And I'll add as well, let's see that really with Node is focusing on the data, right? Like we're not, as Tom pointed out, we don't have plans to build applications on top of this. The idea is that we make the data available for the sector for free, and it's all standardized. So everybody's looking at the same data and everybody has the same understanding of what all these incentives are, and it is up to date. And the idea is that people are going to go away and build their own tools for consumers, for contractors, for policymakers, right? And all of that is looking at the same data set. So that is really the point of Node. It's not to necessarily provide the applications, right? We encourage people to go away and do that. But the idea is that we provide a unified data set that all those applications can rely upon. What else? What else should we talk about here? Lots of questions about multifamily incentives being included. Does anybody want to talk about that? And the more specific question by Heather Dees is, are multifamily building incentives included? So they are sometimes included in utility rebate programs under residential and sometimes under CNI programs.
I can start by saying that our current data sets do not comprehensively index multifamily incentives. We have, of course, those incentives that apply to multifamilies under 4 units, which often get lumped in with single family. But as mentioned, in terms of the roadmap, it certainly could be something that we, look at soon after having produced the node data. I think once we're able to start collecting and sequencing requests and being able to assess interest, we'll be able to propose a position of a sequence of new types of data to introduce.
Okay, we have a question from Owen coming up. Is the Building Decarbonization Coalition looking into community solar? So I will take this as like if there are incentives that are related to community solar for residential, then yes, we will look to get those included into the Node Collective database. Was that the answer? But Owen, if you can't speak, feel free to chat. There's a policy question that I'm hoping that Lacey or maybe Autumn or Deandra can jump in. So Max is asking if we can elaborate on how this can facilitate policy analysis and how that motivation will drive the structure of the data. So maybe covered by Q6. I don't know what Q6 is.
I guess I'll jump in and say, I think this has been said a few times, but we hope that people will use this data to build tools and platforms that enable policy analysis. Desire is for example, a tool where we hope, policymakers currently use this to see what other states are doing and be able to do some comparative analysis. So making this data available in a consistent format should enable this, but we currently don't have plans to undertake this as the Node Collective.
Yeah, I can add on to that. Similarly, at Rewiring, we're using our existing incentive database to estimate the cost of, doing whole home electrification in different regions. And we have two threads there. One is like, where are people very well served? That's something we can then lead with marketing and awareness and get people to access the existing incentives that could be helping them today. And where are places underserved? And that's somewhere that we can target policy advocacy and outreach, or we can look to bring in additional financial support from other channels. So that's something we're actively doing now with the limited subset of data we have. And we're keen to get the unified data set out of Node so that we can do that comprehensively nationwide.
Yeah, and I guess taking off my Eli hat for a second, outside of this, I am a policymaker, and I will say very frequently, sometimes it's difficult to assess the full breadth of policies within our state, particularly at different levels. When we reach out to legislative analysis, sometimes it can even take them a bit to gather it all. And so making sure that, all various stakeholders, whether those be advocates, community groups, or just people who are curious and interested, have the ability to see what's happening, access that in a standardized way, and then, elevate and utilize it in a way that's meaningful, I think can give tremendous opportunity, both from the actionable purpose of how this can plug into tools, but also the knowledge building purpose of being able to see what's where. And then as what's noted, perhaps see where some areas of opportunity could be to really maximize the impact for maybe a group or area that isn't seeing quite as much benefit.
There's an interesting question about the schema that was just put on the chat that I'd love Tom or Freddie to take on, but I'll just take one real quick by Chris, was asking about the granularity of the data for local utilities like Reading Municipal Light offering incentives for residents of Reading, Massachusetts. Only being in Massachusetts myself, I thought I should take that question. So yes, the idea is that we will get that granular. So with the ambition is to capture full coverage. So 100% of all residential incentives nationwide, including municipal ones. Now, municipal incentives are much more difficult to get a hold of and even know that they exist. But we, as the BDC, have done some work to collect all municipal level incentives and rebates in California. And we would like for all of those, for all states to eventually be included in the Node directory. Hey, we have a few more minutes. Time for a few more questions. What do you reckon?
There's a little bias towards the most recent questions because there's a enormous list of questions. But there were just to really, to make sure people leave the call understanding like the data will not be restricted in usage. Like I said, we have an open question about how we track usage so that we can be responsible publishers of this information. But we don't have any intent to control the applications or usages of the data once it's distributed. And then a kind of similar question, if folks are leaving the call disappointed that Node itself won't offer an API, Rewiring America certainly will, Eli certainly will for other contexts, and we hope and encourage and expect other members to build tools on top of this. Even if they have their own proprietary data set, they can cross-reference our data set to keep their own stuff up to date. Like really anything we're doing to reduce the cost of building products on a data set like this and building analysis and doing policy advocacy, all of these different things. The hope is that having this baseline data set available saves a bunch of toil across all of these organizations. Our founding members know that they're going to benefit from that, but we hope many, many more organizations benefit immediately as well. And then there was a question about timeline. I think that's another one that people want to leave the call with a good understanding of timing. I think sharing the schema, as Freddie alluded to, is right around the corner. We had hoped that we would be sharing it on this call, and we didn't quite make that cutoff, as is the case with lots of software and technical work. We uncovered more stuff as we worked on it. But we are still continuing to meet weekly on this stuff and continuing to drive towards a convergence point of having a schema that we can share and seek feedback on. And we'll be sharing that with the broader community as soon as that's available. So hopefully, I would say hopefully weeks, may realistically be a little longer than that, but we're certainly hoping to have more to show this summer and not be kicking the can down the road further than that.
Okay. With that, with 1 minute to go, shall we call it a day? Any more burning questions? Else, I will just thank everybody for participating, all the panelists who are dedicating their time to this, and all the organizations involved in Node who are really dedicating their own resources to actually get this initiative off the ground. We hope that many more people here will be keen to join and be excited about Node and help us move this forward. We want to see Node not just as an initiative of 5 orgs, but perhaps 50 or 500, dare I say. All right, folks. Thank you. Thank you again so much for this, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, everyone.